For over a century, New Zealand threw everything it had at a single weed. They sprayed it with herbicides from plains, they bulldozed it flat, they burned entire hillsides to black earth. And every single time, the gorse came back thicker, faster, and more aggressive than before. By the late 20th century, the country was spending millions of dollars a year fighting a plant that had infested hundreds of thousands of hectares of farmland. A thorny, yellow flowering shrub originally imported from Britain as garden hedging. Government inspectors patrolled rural boundaries, issuing fines and court orders against any landowner who failed to destroy it. The tools got heavier. The chemicals got stronger. The gorse kept winning. The reason is structural. Every weapon deployed against this weed, fire, machinery, poison triggered the exact biological response that made the infestation worse. Not slightly worse, catastrophically worse. The eradication campaign wasn't failing despite the effort, it was failing because of it. And the fix, when it came, wasn't a better herbicide or a bigger bulldozer. It was a botanist who walked into a gorse thicket, looked at the ground, and saw something a century of weed inspectors had never bothered to check. He bought 109 hectares of the worst-looking land on the peninsula, removed every farm animal, stopped every spray program, and planted exactly 0 trees. The weed was left completely alone. What happened over the next 3 decades rebuilt an entire valley from the soil up, 47 permanent waterfalls, 350 native plant species, and a forest that now pays for its own expansion. The Banks Peninsula juts off the eastern coast of New Zealand's South Island, the eroded remnant of ancient volcanic craters, steep-sided and deeply cut with narrow valleys running toward the sea. Before humans arrived, the entire peninsula was buried under 56,000 hectares of continuous old-growth forest. The lower slopes held massive podocarp and hardwood species, towering trees that had been growing for centuries in soils that had never been compacted, never been grazed, never been exposed to direct sun. Polynesian settlers removed roughly a third of that canopy over several hundred years, clearing the drier ridges with fire. But the interior valleys stayed intact. When European colonists arrived around 1840, the peninsula was still heavily wooded. What followed was one of the fastest deforestation events in recorded history. Driven by the economics of pastoral agriculture, sheep, cattle, timber settlers clear-felled and burned the landscape at industrial speed. Between 1840 and 1900, barely 2 human generations, over 98% of the native forest was erased. 56,000 hectares became 61, and the mechanical chain of failure started immediately. The native forest had functioned as a hydrological sponge, roots anchoring the volcanic soil, leaf litter slowing rainfall, the canopy moderating temperature and wind. Remove the canopy, and everything it regulated broke at once. Rain hit exposed clay and ran straight off. The soil compacted under the hooves of introduced livestock. Streams that had flowed year-round for millennia began drying up completely every summer, then flooding violently every winter. The topsoil washed downhill in sheets. Into this wrecked landscape stepped gorse. In its native Europe, it's a modest, manageable shrub kept in check by cold winters and native seed-eating insects. In New Zealand's mild climate, released from every natural control, it colonized the degraded hillsides like a fire front, thorny, fast-growing, and effectively impossible to walk through. Within decades, it had become the single most expensive agricultural pest plant in the country's history. But gorse was a symptom, and the treatments being applied to it were about to make everything far worse. The New Zealand government's approach to gorse was not a suggestion, it was law. Under the Noxious Plants Act of 1978, regional councils held enforcement power to compel every landowner to destroy the weed on their property. County inspectors patrolled farm boundaries. Fines were severe. Failure to comply could result in court-ordered aerial spraying at the landowner's expense. The standard arsenal included 3 weapons: controlled burning to clear entire hillsides, mechanical bulldozing, and root raking to crush the thickets flat, and aerial herbicide spraying. Chemicals like 2,4,5-T glyphosate and triclopyr dumped from low-flying aircraft across enormous tracts of land. None of it worked. A mature gorse stand deposits between 10,000 and 40,000 seeds per square meter into the soil beneath it. Those seeds have a hard, water-resistant coat that makes them nearly impervious to decay. They sit in the ground perfectly viable for 40 years, and in some conditions close to a century. Every square meter of infested land holds tens of thousands of those dormant seeds, waiting for one specific physical trigger: heat. The seed coat cracks when it's exposed to high temperatures or intense physical disturbance. In gorse's native European habitat, that trigger comes from the occasional wildfire or natural soil churning, rare events that release a fraction of the bank at a time. But on the Banks Peninsula, that trigger was arriving on schedule every year courtesy of the government. Burning the hillsides delivered exactly the thermal shock the seeds needed. The fire killed the adult plants, cleared the competition, and cracked thousands of dormant seed coats simultaneously. Within weeks of a burn, the charred ground was carpeted with fresh gorse seedlings, more of them than had existed before the fire. Bulldozing triggered the same result through a different mechanism. The machinery ripped open the soil, exposed buried seeds to sunlight, and physically scraped the seed coats against rock and clay. The cleared, sunlit ground was the exact germination environment the seeds had been waiting decades to receive. Herbicides killed the standing plants, but left the seed bank completely untouched. Every adult gorse bush removed by chemical spray simply opened a hole in the canopy, flooding the ground with the full sunlight the dormant seeds required. The eradication campaign had created a perfect closed loop. Every method of destruction was a method of propagation. The harder the government fought, the faster the weed spread, and the law required them to keep fighting. Active restoration through nursery planting cost between $8,000 and $20,000 per hectare, and survival rates on these exposed, drought-prone hillsides rarely cleared 60% after 5 years. The landscape was locked in both directions. The seed bank guaranteed the weeds' return after every intervention, and the Noxious Plants Act guaranteed the interventions would continue. And no one, not the farmers, not the inspectors, not the regional councils, had stopped to look underneath the gorse at what was actually happening at ground level. Between 1983 and 1988, a botanist named Hugh Wilson spent years surveying the Banks Peninsula, cataloging whatever remnant native flora still clung to the landscape. During those surveys, he did something that a century of weed inspectors and aerial spray operators had never done. He crawled into the gorse. You can understand why nobody had. What he found underneath changed everything. Thousands of native forest seedlings, broadleaf hardwoods, ferns, pioneer species were germinating and thriving in the sheltered ground beneath the thorny canopy. Not scattered individuals, thousands, in densities that exceeded anything the most expensive manual planting programs on the peninsula had ever produced. The logic runs backwards. Gorse was not a permanent infestation. It was a transitional stage, a nurse canopy performing 3 critical jobs simultaneously that no government program had managed to replicate. The gorse was fertilizing the soil. It belongs to the same family as beans and peas. Its roots host bacteria that pull nitrogen directly from the atmosphere and lock it into the ground. The peninsula's clay had been stripped of nitrogen by a century of overgrazing. The gorse was restoring it for free. Beyond the chemistry, the dense, interlocking thorns formed a physical barrier that excluded every browsing mammal on the peninsula: feral deer, goats, rabbits, possums. Native seedlings growing inside the thickets were untouchable. No fencing program, no pest control budget could have provided that level of coverage across thousands of hectares of steep, inaccessible hill country. And the canopy itself was engineering weather, blocking drying coastal winds, shading the soil from summer heat, and trapping moisture against the ground. It created a humid, sheltered bubble of different conditions underneath, the exact environment native forest seeds need to germinate on bare, compacted clay. And the entire mechanism ran on a timer. Gorse cannot survive without full direct sunlight. A mature bush maxes out at 3 to 4 meters tall, and its biological lifespan tops out at roughly 30 to 45 years. The native hardwoods growing in its shelter, species like Canuka, Maho, tree fuchsia, routinely reach 6 to 10 meters. Once they overtopped the gorse and closed their canopy above it, they would cut off its light supply entirely. The gorse would die, collapse into the forest floor, and add its biomass to the soil it had spent decades enriching. Every dollar spent burning, bulldozing, and spraying the weed had been resetting this clock to zero. In September 1987, Wilson and conservation financier Maurice White purchased 109 hectares of exhausted gorse-choked farmland in the Otanerito Valley through the Maurice White Native Forest Trust. The intervention consisted of two actions. They removed every sheep and cow from the land, and they permanently stopped every form of weed control. No burning, no bulldozing, no spraying, no manual planting. $0 spent on interior restoration. Under the Noxious Plants Act, this was technically illegal. The regional council could have forced aerial herbicides spraying across the entire property, which would have destroyed the regenerating native understory along with the gorse. The local farming community, watching the unchecked weed explode across the neighboring hillside, viewed Wilson and White as a biosecurity threat. A tense legal standoff produced one compromise. The trust would manually clear a 10-meter buffer strip around the reserve's perimeter, keeping gorse off neighboring land. Inside that boundary, the weed had absolute authority. What followed once humans simply stopped touching the land would take 37 years to fully unfold and would dwarf anything conventional restoration had ever produced on the peninsula. For the first 5 years, the reserve looked like proof that Wilson was wrong. Without grazing pressure, the gorse detonated across the property, massive, impenetrable walls of thorny yellow scrub consuming every visible hillside. Neighbors called them fools and dreamers. By any visible measure, the experiment appeared to be an unmitigated disaster. But beneath the canopy, the feedback loop was already running in the correct direction. Within 6 years, monitoring plots showed native seedling densities under the gorse exceeding 7,000 stems per hectare. That density would have cost tens of thousands of dollars per hectare to replicate through nursery planting, with substantially worse survival rates. At Hinewai, it was happening for free. By the late 1990s, the first native trees punched through the gorse line. Kanuka and broadleaf hardwoods, growing fast and straight toward the light, breached 3 meters, then 4, then 6. Their crowns spread and locked together. The canopy closed, and beneath it, starved of sunlight, the gorse did precisely what Wilson had predicted. Whole stands withered, collapsed, and fell into the forest floor, decomposing into the soil they had spent decades fertilizing. The same compounding logic that had destroyed the landscape for a century now ran in reverse. Deeper roots broke compacted clay. Porous soil held rainfall. Retained moisture fed the trees. Bigger trees held more soil. The loop accelerated. Then the system was tested. In July 2011, a lightning strike ignited a fire that burned 300 hectares, roughly a third of the reserve. The gorse seed bank germinated on cue, carpeting the scorched hillsides exactly as it had done after every government burn for the past century. But the native trees didn't die. They resprouted from charred root systems that were already deep and established, outpacing the fresh gorse seedlings in less than half the time of the original successional cycle. The system had built its own resilience to the one event most likely to destroy it. A decade later, an extreme storm dumped 300 millimeters of rain in days, triggering over 100 landslides that stripped 70 hectares of canopy down to bare rock. Within 3 weeks, native seedlings were emerging from the debris. By day 65, thousands of them blanketed the exposed soil. The biological engine restarted without a single human instruction. In February 2012, an ecologist named Melissa Hutchison, conducting a routine survey, discovered a population of a small native tree called the heart-leaved kohuhu, growing in a dry gully on the peninsula. The species had not been recorded on the Banks Peninsula since a French botanist first documented it in 1840, an absence of 170 years. Its maximum lifespan is around 120 years, so no single individual could have survived the entire gap. The species had maintained a viable, reproducing population hidden in the steepest, roughest terrain for nearly 2 centuries, enduring fire, grazing, and deforestation so severe that individual plants never grew tall enough to be noticed. The passive restoration hadn't just grown new forest, it had revealed genetic survivors that no planting program could have known to include. The regenerating forest now sequesters approximately 2,710 tons of carbon dioxide per year. Under New Zealand's emissions trading scheme, that passive absorption generates over $100,000 in annual revenue income the trust channels directly into purchasing adjacent degraded farmland. The original 109 hectares have expanded to over 1,426. 350 native plant species have reestablished across the valley. 35 native bird species, including tua, bellbirds, and the New Zealand pigeon, have returned to a stretch of peninsula where they had been functionally absent for generations, and 47 permanent waterfalls now flow year-round through gullies that ran dry every summer for more than a century. To replicate this result through conventional planting, nursery seedlings, manual labor, chemical weed control, fencing, and years of maintenance, the conservative estimate exceeds $11 million. The interior of Hinewai Reserve cost nothing. From those original 109 hectares of surrendered farmland, the decision to stop fighting reversed 100 years of compounding mechanical failure, restored a hydrological system, brought back 35 bird species, and uncovered a plant that predates the destruction itself. The gorse seed bank is still in the soil. It will outlast everyone alive today. And that is precisely the point. The landscape was never going to be fixed by fighting the weed. The weed was the fix, a transitional stage dressed in thorns, running on a timed biological schedule that every spray program and bulldozer blade kept resetting to zero. The most expensive part of the entire project was learning to do nothing. If that kind of engineering interests you, systems that repair themselves the moment you stop breaking them, subscribe. There's more coming.